Now, continuing with our budget coverage, youth advocates are pretty disappointed with last night's budget. Acheson is the Chief Executive of Youth Action and Chair of the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition, and she joins me now. Acheson, welcome. What was in that budget for young Australians?
Oh, nothing. Did you see even the words young person or youth? I mean, we saw it for a little bit with youth allowance for regional young people. There's a little bit more of a stretch to allow some young people to get youth allowance in regional areas and ab study. And there's a little bit in there that's about transition to work program extending, but really there's just nothing in there for young people, which is completely baffling.
We just had one of our reporters speaking to people on the trains going into Melbourne from one of the outer suburbs, and the young people there were saying they were really happy with infrastructure commitments. So can young people point to things like infrastructure and the tax cuts and say they will benefit through them?
Well, I think like looking at particular areas where transport is such a major issue for them. So Western Sydney is a great example. There's a real need. We hear it all the time from young people that transport is an issue. So spending for things like transport is fantastic. However, not addressing housing affordability and high youth unemployment rates is just shocking. I mean, there was just nothing about dealing with housing affordability in this budget, which, you know, thinking about the election coming up next year, you would have thought that the government would be trying to sort of show how they're going to sort of fix these massive issues, but they have done nothing.
Just on youth unemployment, the government would argue that it has got, it's created hundreds of thousands of jobs over the last couple of years.
A million.
And it's doing a really good job on that front.
It's doing a fantastic job creating 1 million jobs over the last 5 years, but if you look at the youth unemployment rate, it's gone up. So those jobs are not going to young people. The problem with that is if we don't get young people into work earlier, they're going to stay unemployed for longer, which is worse off for their trajectory for the rest of their lives. In addition, the money that we're waiting for them to pay taxes for our ageing population is not going in. We have to get young people into work to be able to have the money in the coffers for these cuts that we're seeing right now.
And we heard earlier the Council of Social Service saying it was deeply disappointed that there was no increase to the New Start allowance. Is that a key area for young people too?
100%. I mean, Youth Allowance and New Start are both way below the poverty line in Australia, their minimum wage. And so we're looking at all of these people in Australia who are trying to find work and they're struggling to find a place to live, pay their rent, their electricity bills and put food in their bellies. And then we're expecting them to be able to find jobs when there aren't jobs, particularly for young people. We need to increase that rate. So I'd love to see that $10 that's going to middle and low income earners be given to sort of New Start and Youth Allowance, because that $10 a day would make a massive difference to those young people.
And so what were you hoping for on housing affordability?
For real leadership from the government. How are we going to address the fact that housing is insecure in Australia now? Not only is it about that young people can't afford to buy a house, they can't afford the rent. We've seen a 44% increase over the last 10 years in rent across the board. Young people are being locked out of the market and homelessness rates are spiking because of it.
And so specifically, what can the federal government do on that front? Do you want them to get rid of negative gearing?
Oh, look, negative gearing, capital gains tax, looking at sort of the tax system and the wealth distribution in Australia. We need to address this. It's a very complex issue, but there are very smart people in Parliament who can address this. They're just choosing not to. And I think it's time. We are getting to the point of crisis where we're seeing so many people who are in insecure housing. It's getting out of control. The government has to step in and start making some hard decisions, and they just don't want to.
So were you really surprised at the lack of attention to youth in that budget last night?
Yeah, I just don't understand. I mean, normally what you see is the government trying to sort of make budget cuts or things in the budget that work for the whole population. Youth were completely absent. It was a massive blind spot in this budget. And you have to ask the question, with 20% of the population being excluded, what does that say to that population? And what does the government think about young people? And it doesn't look good for young people in Australia. And they are representative of the whole population. They need to be seriously thinking about what they're going to do to address these issues, because young people's living conditions are degrading and they have lower living standards than their parents. We've got to do something quickly.
Okay, Acheson, thanks so much for coming and have a chat.
Thanks for having me.